Okay, so what we're going to do today is go through a lot. The idea is not for you to fully understand everything. The idea is for you to be like, oh yeah, I've seen that before, when you're thinking on your project and you need to think of something. And the lecture, the slides, and eventually the recording will all be available, so like this will just be like a resource for you. So a little bit about me. I write a lot. Check out my site, check out my GitHub. I didn't put it on here, but LinkedIn, my name is Mike Cronin. Probably should have said that at some point. And then my cat has diabetes. It's irrelevant to everything, and yet that is a cornerstone of my being. So I just wanted you to know. So the best metaphor that I have ever heard for what a web page is if a web page is a wizard, the HTML is the raw body, the CSS is the clothing, and the JavaScript is the magic. That is really, really good explanation of everything that we're going to be talking about, because without CSS, everything still works. It just looks like it's 1999. There's the same site with CSS and without CSS. So before we get into CSS, I just want to essentially cover the bases, because I know that HTML and CSS are kind of blown through. So we're just going to talk about HTML for like 5 minutes and then move on. Basically, it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is made out of tags, and all those tags really do is have built-in CSS to tell the browser to either look a certain way or do certain things. So this is like the most basic of pages. You can see you have up there, you have your head. That's where you put metadata about the page. In this case, you would obviously put a lot more than that, but I'm only saying title, my great page. And then inside the body, that's where you actually put your content. So H1 tags, P tags, hopefully you guys know what those are, but that's heading and paragraph. We're going to talk a little bit about those attributes in a second, because they are very important for CSS, but I just want to break it down that there's an opening tag, a children tag or a text node, and then your closing tag. Sometimes the closing tag, that slash, is within the opening tag, like for inputs. But for the most part, this is generally how HTML works, and we're going to talk about the ID and the class when we get to CSS, but those are called attributes. This is also something called a non-semantic tag and a semantic tag, which is a really fancy way of saying the semantic tag is just, it's explaining what it is. An image tag is an image, a P tag is a paragraph, versus a non-semantic tag, which is just for organization and content. They're basically just divs and spans. And we'll get to the difference later on between those. But those are for organization versus content, which tells you what it is. A few important tags. Just, again, I told you it's very basic. So we've got headings, text, links, images, ordered and unordered lists, and forms and inputs. These are basically what they look like. I do want to take a second to talk about links. They're pretty straightforward most of the time. You have a file that you've linked to. You have an outside site that you link to. The difference being whether or not you're using a relative path or the HTTPS protocol or some other protocol. And then the target blank. That is a really useful trick if you want them to open a link not in the tab and essentially lose the traffic. If you want to like let them be helpful, but be like, hey, don't forget about me. Target blank is what you would do. But I want to talk really quickly about the bookmark. So as you can see here, this page, I needed to be able to scroll. There's this hello guy right here. You can actually link to within the page. See how it jumps up and brings us to the top? That's because it has an ID of hi, and whenever you click this, it will say, I will go to that part on this page. I will not leave the page. I will just try and find that here. Okay, and then you got your lists, and then you have your forms. I am literally only bringing this up to make sure you always, always, always use a label for your inputs. Don't use a P, use label, because that is going to be excellent for accessibility, which is becoming more and more important because frankly companies are getting sued for it. They wouldn't do the right thing on their own, they're just literally getting sued. And also it's really cool for screen readers and robots, looking your page up and down and making sure they know what they're doing. That is how you tell them, like, oh yeah, look, that input is a name input. I know it sometimes seems cool to put placeholder text instead. Don't. You can put placeholders and labels, but always put labels. That's my spiel. the point of HTML for this program, you guys are not so much writing web pages as web applications. So I want you to think a little bit more, you guys know what a GUI is? Graphical user interface. Kind of think about it like that. It's not so much like a page for a restaurant where you just need to put up a menu in hours. You're really trying to be interactive and keep the components clean. So the way you should do this with your HTML is kind of have an idea when you're writing it that you're eventually going to put functionality and CSS onto it. So an example of that is, this is perfectly valid. It's also terrible. H1PP, H1PP. You can kind of see that those are two separate things. Let's say this was your information account and then, I don't know, like a friend you clicked on. So tell us that. Saying put them into a div, a non-semantic element. It'll just show you it's just for organization. So now it's a little clearer, and you have some nice spacing to sort of literally show you there's a hierarchy here. Those two things are not one object. And also that P is fine, but it's a little misleading because it really should be a list. Ideally, if I had more room on the page, I would have put more. But you can kind of see that those are just listed out, so you should put them in a list. You should use lists a lot, because I remember this program and you all have like index pages where they just list out a bunch of resources. Those should always be in lists. I know it's perfectly acceptable to put them in divs and just barf them out onto a page, but again, going back to accessibility and screen readers, help the poor robots. Let them know that these things are related and that there are more than one. So that's just something to sort of think about when you're writing HTML. Keep in mind that later on it's going to be used for CSS and it's going to be used for interactivity. So, okay, cool. Let's talk about CSS. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. You basically just select elements and then you tell them what to do. It's really simple to start. So here is CSS, which I'm sure you've all seen, and here are the individual pieces. You have your selector on the side that's selecting all H1 tags, and it's telling them that their color should be a value of a hex. I guess that's actually red, I'm not 100% sure, 980,000. And you have your property and your value. So like everything in programming, it's all just key value pairs. And then that part is called the declaration. I've literally never heard anyone say that. They usually just refer to that part as a rule, but if you want to be pretentious or like nail an interview, be like, as you can see from the declaration, they'll be like, oh. Okay, so the other thing we're really only going to talk about for selectors are tags, IDs, and classes. The point of an ID, which you guys should know, is to keep something unique. If you have an ID and they're both 2, you have a really big problem. So in HTML, it's a lot more permissive. You can put more than one ID on the page, but if you do that, I will scratch your eyes out. It's a terrible thing to do, and it can lead to some really frustrating bugs. So ID means there is only one of these at a time on this page. Class means there's a bunch of these. Do whatever you want. There's going to be like 12 of these bad boys on the page. They're all going to look like this. And the way you differentiate between them is a hash for example ID, or hash for an ID name. So if it was, so ID high is hash high, and then a period for a class. ID, only one. Class, as many as you want. So there are several ways to actually get CSS into your document. The main way you should always use is external. An external file. It is possible to load it inline. It is possible to load it inside the HTML document in a style tag. Don't do that unless there's like a really solid reason you need literally only a single document in your project. Always load it externally with a link in the head. So it's a little different than the other kinds of links. There's a relevance property and it says style sheet, and then the href is the actual file itself. As you've seen in React, and I believe Rails also does it, this is not something you do. You like load it in through separate things. There's all sorts of kind of cool stuff you can do. But when you're working on a simple page like this, that's all you got to do. Link, relevant style sheet, href, styles. So the actual CSS stuff that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about spacing in units, we're going to talk about the display types, and we're going to talk about, I couldn't think of a better word for it, but basically what rules override other rules, because that is the thing that frustrates people with CSS, is when it decides to listen to one rule and you wanted it to listen to another. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But to start off, units of measure, you've already seen color has a hex code, but the common ones for space are pixels, ems, and rems. We don't have time to talk about it, but basically just always use a rem, don't use an em, and try to avoid pixels. The reason being that rem are based off of a root, so if your site is on mobile or if your site is on a desktop and the font size changes, the browser will decide this, your rems will still all be in correct relationships to each other. That is very helpful and it keeps things nice and stable. If you use pixels, you're going to run into a bit of a trouble because the pixels will be a little too big in certain places and not big enough in others. But if you use rem, it will be adapted, or it will be, thank you, I was going to say reflexive and that's wrong, responsive to whatever the base font size is. It's usually 16 pixels. And you can also experiment, you can do like 0.1 rem if you want to go down, but just use rem, just do it. Okay, so here's an example of some CSS. You can see you have width, mid-width, max width, height, and then overflow. We're going to talk about those in a second, but basically width is exactly what you think it is. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So here we go. We have my width is 80, my min width is 35, and my max width is 60 rem. So you can see, let me put a border on this. Whoop. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry. Border is what you think it is. There's a better introduction to this, but it's exactly what you think it is. It's a literal border. Okay, so as you can see, the width of this is 80% of the page, the min width and max width. Let's explore that, see how it scales with the page properly, and then it stops. That's our max width. And then it scales with the page properly, and then it stops. That is our min width. So that's really useful if you are, for instance, designing something for mobile, which is everything nowadays. That will keep you from having things like, oh, it's 100% of the screen on mobile, and then you open it in a browser and it's a monstrosity. So like mid width and mid height and mid max height, same idea. They just allow you to put parameters on things.
There's also width there.
Yes, the width is the thing that's actually doing the change. See how it's sort of like an if-else statement. So if it's greater than 35 rem and if it's less than 60 rem, it's going to be 80% of the page, the actual page that I am moving around. However, once it gets to 65, it's done. It stops. I will never be larger than 65. And same idea if it's 35. So it lets you keep it, I don't know, like if you really like this for a tablet, it lets you keep things looking exactly how you want without having to do what's called adaptive CSS. That is when you literally have like 9 different configurations for the different screen sizes, and you may have to do that a little bit, but it's not great. So these responsive methods and like for just percentages in general, those will help you avoid that and just cut down on your development time. You don't need to do the same thing 9 different times. It's gonna look the way you want it at any resolution. And now the overflow. That's this part. So see how it scrolls? If I comment this out, it does not. It just shows me everything. And you get this classic CSS annoyance of a border in the middle of a word and it looks like crap. So that overflow, there are various values that you can look into, but they essentially just control your scroll.
Real quick, overflow X, is that like for vertically? If you
For
did
X,
Y,
the X, yes, there's an overflow Y, and overflow does both of them. There we go. Okay, so you guys basically get it. It's just scaling stuff. That's good. Any questions? Okay, cool. This is the really annoying part. The really annoying part of CSS is what's called the box model, and that determines how your elements are spaced on a page. And given your primary function at this camp is just to get things working, this is the most important part because you just want to have a good layout. So you have margin, border, and padding. That's basically how this works. So margin is the space outside of the border. Border is the border. I couldn't think of a good way to put that. And padding is the space between the border and the actual content. So that will either be your text node or your children node. So if you have a div and then an h1 inside the div, the h1 is the content to the div, and then it recurses all the way down. So like h1 will also have a margin, a border, and a padding, and a content. So you can kind of see how to do, you saw me do the border really quickly, but basically border is a shorthand for like border top, border left, border right, border bottom. But usually you do not need them to be different values, so you just put your Thickness first, 0.1 rem. Your line style, 99% of the time it's going to be solid because it's not 1999 and we don't care about dashes. And then at the end, it'll be the color. I'm usually just using like literal words here. You can do that. There are 170 of them, but you can also use hex code values or RGB or RGB alpha, which lets you have transparencies. But that right there is what you're going to be using a lot because you're just prototyping things and you need to see the boundaries. The margin and padding look identical. That's if you want all of the things to be the same. But if you want to set the margin differently, more often this is padding, there is a way, instead of using margin top, margin bottom, margin side, margin left, margin right, the way you give it between 1 and 4 numbers will determine what those numbers refer to, and it moves clockwise. So if you just give 1 value, all the values are the same. If you give 2 values, the first is the top and bottom, the second is the sides. If you give 3, the first is the top, the second is the sides, and the third is the bottom. If you give 4, it's A, B, C, D. That's just kind of confusing, so heads up to that. It's the same with something, I didn't talk about it, but border radius. That lets you, literally, I put a border radius on these. It keeps them from being sharp and pointy, except it's tilted. So this is A, B, C, D. Does that make sense? It's kind of weird. Yeah? You look like you have a question. Do you want to say the question? Or was I wrong?
No, you're right.
Okay. If I'm wrong, please just correct me because we don't have time for this. Like, just let me know. I hate when like the teacher's like, oh, this is it, and you're like sitting there like, oh my God, there's a typo. This will break everything. So just let me know. All right. The other core part of layout is display. And that tells your document how to treat elements. You have 3 types. You will mainly be concerned with 2, block, inline, and inline block. Block says, I am alone. Nobody on my line. You get out of my yard. So like if these were H1s, you can't put H1s next to each other automatically. They will always try and push the next one to the next line. Inline is for links inside of text or the span. It says, it's all good. Everything's going to flow together. I do not care if you occupy the same line as me. Inline block is a combination of the 2, and it will make sense once this is kind of ingrained. It says, yes, things can exist on the same line as me. However, I will allow them to have a top and bottom height and right to left height. Inline ignores top and bottom. It just doesn't care. It assumes they have none, and they are whatever width they are. Block is the only one that lets you have all of them and occur on the same line. It's a little confusing. You just have to like put it in your bones and just get used to it. But this is a rough approximation of how those things are going to react. For you guys, when you're styling things, the main thing you're going to want to do is throw a display block on there. If something is misbehaving, 9 times out of 10, it's because it's an inline element or some sort of weird inline element where you just want it to have more of a margin on the top. Just give it a block. Just do that. That will make it respond much more obviously to the way you're doing it. The other ones are exactly, you would not, by the way, do this to P.
Yeah.
You would just do one at a time. I just needed to show in context. So it's just block, and inline. There are more options, but those are the 3 basics. Okay, so this is exactly what I just said. Basically block. Block it out, man. All right. So this is the other weird, frustrating part is that rules override other rules in ways that are not always super clear. Generally, if the rule comes later in the style sheet, as in it cascades down, that rule wins. However, more specific rules beat out more general rules. So in this instance, and again, this would be more complicated, but let's say you have a giant CSS file you forgot, the P is going to be overridden by the blue. You will not see any red. All the P tags will be overridden by the second rule because it cascades later. It's more important. However, even though it comes first, specific beats the general because that is a ID and that is a class name. So there are more classes, so CSS is like, oh, ID, they must really want to do this thing, I will do this thing for them. But it's not always that clear. There's a link later on. The selectors can get quite complex. You can do children of relatives of parents followed by immediates with a class name of whatever. Generally try to avoid that because those are the weird sorts of things that cause bugs. But just be aware if a rule is being overridden and you're like, why? If it's not later, it means there's something that's more specific. So oftentimes, just throw an ID on there and then it automatically wins. But just something to be aware of, and always try and keep your CSS very simple. So this is immediately clear why that's happening. The more complex you get, the harder that is to see. All right, cool. That was a lot. That was a lot. Does all that stuff make sense? Yeah. Does it actually? Because we have totally lots of time. All right, cool. Flexbox is great and the only thing you really need to use. I love it. I don't know why there are. Has anyone ever used CSS Grid? Has anyone ever used CSS Flexbox? All right. I don't know why you use Grid, maybe you had to, but like the teachers here were super into Grid and not at all into Flexbox, even though this is exactly what you need. So Flexbox basically just tells a parent how to order or how to organize its children. So let's say we have it on a list right here, and I have two. You know what? I'm just going to show you. So we have, because live coding is easier to understand. So we have a lot of things here. This is not ideal. I do not want this. This is not how I want to display the data. So I'm going to enable this CSS rule for these individual person cards. Okay, that's better. Now you can see they have margins and borders. It's a little clearer what's going on, but still, you know what I want. I want them side to side like everything you guys do. So what I need to do, first of all, I don't know if you've seen, I feel like they would have shown you this by now, but I'm removing, right over here, I'm removing the basic list where they all have like weird padding and a dot, which is not what you want. But then, here's the magic part. This is all it takes to get them to look exactly how I want. I'm just gonna take off this. There we go. Boom. 3 lines, and it's perfect. It is exactly what you want. They are ordered. They will go when you move it. It is. Oh, it's gonna block me. Oh, hang on. Let me take off that middle. Hang on. There we go. Sorry. You don't need to see that. So this will allow me. See how they like pop down automatically to the next one? Flexbox just decides that, and it keeps them organized. And tell me this is not exactly what you want all the time on your show pages. And it's done in 3 little lines the same way every time, no matter what you're doing, no matter how many elements. It's the best. I love Flexbox. It keeps you sane because you don't care. You just want those stupid elements on the page.
So Flexbox doesn't override those other rules like max width, border, and all that other stuff?
It can, and you can sort of see them moving. There are certain ways. Flexbox gets a lot more complicated. I don't want to make it sound like this is all it does. But for the most part, it will respect what you do. Like, for instance, if I gave each one of those cards a margin of 2 rem, it just moves them. It just understands like, oh, okay, each one of my elements, what would that even do? Terrible. But it doesn't care. It will keep them. I have a width of 40 rem, or a margin of 40 rem here, and it keeps them all the same. Flexbox is it's very flexible. It will listen to those things. Now there are ways, I'm showing you Flexbox on the parent, but there's a link I'll get to later where it's Flexbox for the children. Like, you can tell Flexbox to have them all shift to the left or shift to the right or start up and down. There's all sorts of things you can do. But I know from experience when you're getting your index page and you just want to show all the elements, this is basically all you want. It's all you need. It's great. And it's these 3 lines down here. This is it. Display flex, flex wrap, wrap, justify content, space around. Oh, that's a very good point. Okay, borders, these 3 things always exist. Sorry, that's a good question. Always exists. So you can set margin or border to none, margin to 0, padding to 0. They just exist with that value. So if you don't include a border, it's perfectly fine. And honestly, you usually won't. It looks not great. So let me take off the border, and you can see, nope, and you can see, same thing. Now, notice that it does move a teensy-weensy little bit, because now there is 0.1 rem space less to worry about. But borders, padding, and margin always exist. They just have to be defined. So this is it. This is basically what you will need right now most of the time for this program is this. That's about it. But that gets way more complicated, and the greatest FlexBite guide of all, just literally type Flexbox into Google. That should be the first thing that pops up. That gives you a really nice, exhaustive list of how to deal with Flexbox on the parent and how to deal with Flexbox on the children. So I encourage you to check that out. So much so, I'm just going to click it. There we go. So you can see it's broken up. Here's the container, and here are the items. Sorry, not parent and children, container items. So it gives you this really great guide of like how you want it to wrap, where you want it to start. I'm using, I believe, space. Typically I use space around. I think it just looks the nicest, but there's also space evenly. There's center. The world is your oyster. You can do flex start. That allows you to do vertical heights. Center is the easiest and one of the only ways to get responsive centering like that. I'm blanking. Is that vertical or horizontal? Vertical centering?
Vertical.
Horizontal?
Vertical.
This. It's this. So it is one of the only ways to do that easily. CSS Grid also, by the way, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just bringing a bazooka to a knife fight. You don't need it. It will give you even more control. You can do like mosaic tiles, but for the most part, this is all you need. So that is why I wholeheartedly recommend it. Where did my presentation go? Here we go. So there are a lot of good links, but before we go, I just want to talk a little teensy bit about tips and tricks and gotchas. The Chrome console, you guys have kind of seen me, and I'm sure you've played with it yourselves by this point in the program. But you have over here the elements, and what you want to do is click this guy, this little mouse right here, and this will let you scroll over things and click the individual icons, and then you can control it. So let's say I want this guy to have a color of, I don't know, blue. There you go. This is really useful when you're not 100% sure how it should look. Do it here first instead of going over into the file and changing. Sorry, I can make this a bit bigger. This makes it a little easier. Now I will say this, do not abuse this. Do not actually style or design, do not design your project in CSS. That is like pulling teeth. It is atrocious. So like design it on paper, or better yet, there's the program that I love, which I designed this whole project in, is Adobe XD. It's really simple, pared down. It's like Illustrator and Photoshop had a baby who was really simple. I don't know, that metaphor didn't work. It just keeps things really, really simple and really, really clean. I designed my site with it, and it's basically perfect for web development because these kinds of tools are almost all one-to-one conversions of CSS. Like everything in here can be done with CSS. So design your program outside of CSS, but it is helpful sometimes to tweak little things like maybe you want this shade of blue, maybe you want that shade of blue, and you want to see how it looks in the browser. It's okay to use the Chrome and then literally copy this into your actual document. But really got to stress that if you're finding yourself doing a lot of heavy designing in CSS, that's a poor use of time, and there's a quicker way to do it. You just want to make CSS execute your vision. The other thing I wanted to mention really quick is this guy right here, margin 0 auto. That, if you only have one item, what that will do, remember there's two things here, so this 0 refers to the top margin, and this auto refers to the sides. That just says automatically make sure both sides are the same. So if you're only trying to center one item, zero auto is the way to go. But the second you're trying to get 2 or more items to appear synchronous, I would definitely recommend using Flexbox. Okay, that's good, that's good. Careful margin and padding overlaps. That, as you can see, doesn't this look kind of weird? Let's check that out. Why am I looking at the screen? It's mirrored. Look at this. That's kind of odd. Like this, I am telling it that I want a margin on all sides, but you can clearly see from the blue that it's way higher on the top and bottom, and that's because this H1 has a built-in margin. It says I'm going to have a margin of 1 rem on the top and bottom, and that is pushing aside my padding here in green and giving me this weird look. So that's extremely common to see when you're doing CSS, and all you want to do is to set your margins to 0 on certain items. Like that looks a lot better. Generally, I would say inside items, set all the margins to 0 and use padding just to keep it consistent. But you could also reverse that and set all the padding to 0 and always use margin. It's free country. Just keep it consistent because padding and margin do not always play nicely and they will overlap and it will be weird. So that is another thing I want to warn you about. And CSS should always be last. It should be the last thing you do. It will eat your life. This is a black hole. It's addicting. I don't know why. It's never satisfied. So like, leave it to the end so you will literally just run out of time. And that's it. You're done. Because if you do this at the beginning, valuable program functions will be overlooked so your page is the right shade of puce. Like, I want to die. It's the this Excel, like picking the colors, took so long. So irrelevant. No one even notices these things. So just keep that in mind. CSS always goes last. The one caveat is if it's hard to see, layout can be done first, like exactly what I've done here. I have done nothing but give margin, padding, and borders. So I can kind of see, this looks good, this looks weird, all right, moving on. But the second you get to like colors or hues or fancy placements or position apps, you've gone too deep. Don't touch it until your program is done. And then the last thing, less is always more. That's more of a design thing. One color per page, like don't have red, blue, yellow, green, just be like shades of red and maybe a blue.